This is August 19th, 2021, and I'm making this video unexpectedly from a perspective because quite a few people wrote into me expressing, frankly, that they felt some kind of way emotionally about it, that they were reflecting on it intellectually, that one way or another they were thinking about what the war in Afghanistan meant, looking back at the last 20 years and now looking ahead at the next 20 years also. And I do kind of feel like it's my job, even if it's only to share in your suffering, to come on and offer somewhat more profound and useful reflections than what you can get from Jimmy Dore. I have some degree of sympathy for people like Jimmy Dore, but it's inevitable that I also feel some very real contempt for them. And it's almost needless to say, at a time like this, you're going to get absolutely nothing meaningful out of CNN, Fox News. I mean, what you can get out of the mainstream media, in some ways, they're kind of choking on their own past propaganda and wondering what's the new propaganda message now? How is it that they can present, defeat as victory and so on? There's a mixture of very powerful, confusing, self-contradictory messages being put out. When you think about it, it must be really hard to be a kid right now. What if you're 8 years old or 12 years old trying to understand this? And if you're 8 years old or 12 years old, this war has been happening your whole life. It's been happening since before you were born. And sorry, by the way, I don't mean an 8 or 12-year-old in Afghanistan. That's an interesting question too. How do you see this if you're 8 or 12 years old in Afghanistan? How do you see it if you're 8 years old or 12 years old in Syria? Different places around the world. But even if you're just a kid growing up in, the swamp in Florida, in the United States of America, if you're a child right now, it's probably much, much more confusing than it would be for someone my own age, so on and so forth. So, I'm happy to have the questions from the audience. I'm happy. Once in a while, they distract me. So, William McGeehan, you were asking me if I saw the film footage of the Taliban celebrating their victory, riding around on bumper cars. If you watched my YouTube channel, not only have I seen that footage, I've edited and presented it on my YouTube channel. Come on. How can you ask me if I've seen it? It's on à-bas-le-ciel right now. Sorry. I don't mind. This is part of the joy of live streaming. As opposed to doing a pre-recorded videos, I get to respond to this. Of course I've seen it. But yeah, that's a particularly surreal moment of the Taliban. What do you want them to do? They don't drink alcohol. They don't sleep with prostitutes. They don't do the things other armies do when they celebrate a victory. Some of them go to amusement parks and they ride on the bumper cars. Apparently that's how the Taliban celebrate their victory. What are they going to do? Say more prayers? Say more prayers than usual? Anyway, it's nice. We're opening the video, in this kind of affable, relaxed way. Obviously, it's a tremendously serious matter. So let me ask you two hypothetical questions just to situate this topic in all its due seriousness. And as I said at the beginning, I'm making this video now because quite a few people wrote to me asking me to make a video of this kind. And for me, at age 42, I know where they're coming from. This was 20 years of my life. It's 20 years of your life. Anyone who's over 20, this has been 20 years of your life that have gone into this war in Afghanistan, even if it's just been sitting back, engaging in analysis and commentary on it. It's been a huge part of all our lives. So the first question I want you to ask yourself is, what if this is the most significant political event of your lifetime? I think anyone here would say, what a tremendously depressing thought. What if the way the United States of America bungled the war in Afghanistan is the single most important thing in my century, in the century in which I happen to be alive? I think anyone who stops and reflects on it would now feel like, whoa, if that's true, I should have paid much more attention to it. I should have been much more involved. I should have taken much more responsibility because this really matters. And of course it matters. Of course it does. I feel bad for kids. I mean, if you're 12 years old or 15 years old, you might not remember. But, there was a time when extraordinary rendition changed the way America was seen all around the world, when the use of torture changed the way America was seen all around the world. And, in Florida, in the Okefenokee swamp in Florida, you may have forgotten that. Let me tell you something. In Afghanistan, they haven't forgotten. In Iraq, they haven't forgotten. In Iran, they haven't forgotten. In Syria, all around the world, everyone else remembers the extent to which America morally discredited itself in this war, even though there was tremendous sympathy supporting the United States of America, say from 2001 to 2003. the very beginning phase, right after the September 11th attacks, there was an almost unanimous feeling in the Western world, within America and Western Europe and so on, that America was in a morally righteous position to wage war in Afghanistan because of the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers in New York City and September 11th. Anyway, I think I have to start by asking, what if this is it? What if for our generation, this was our World War II, right? What if this was the important war that your grandchildren are going to ask you, well, what did you do during the war, Granddad? What did you, what if this was the momentous, definitive occasion for our generation to change the history of the world? And one, we bungled it. And two, no offense, but you didn't pay very much attention. Now, what does that mean? Let's flesh that out. What does not paying very much attention mean? Can any of you name a war hero from the Afghan war? It's a 20-year war. It's a 20-year war. Can you name a general or a commander? On the American side, presumably, the Italians were there, the British were there, there were all these armies there. Can you name a general or a commander who did something heroic? Can you describe to me one battle from this war? No, I can describe to you battles from the war between Napoleon and the Emperor of Russia, between Napoleon and the Russian Tsar, right? There are all kinds of chapters of history. I can describe riveting battles. I can tell you about heroic people. Sorry, you search your own memory. Some of you will know about particular battles from the American Civil War, from the American Revolutionary War, particular heroes, particular events, right? I have a lot of them fresh in my mind because of reading them. Can you describe to me a single battle? Can you name a single commander, a single leader who did anything heroic in the war? Can you break down for me the political decisions or the strategic decisions that were made by any of the presidents of the United States, whether it's George W. Bush, Obama, or obviously relatively briefly Donald Trump, that mattered, that decided, that determined the outcome or the fate of this war? And again, there probably are other wars you could say that about. Depending on who you are, you might be able to say this about World War I or World War II, or there's some other, the Napoleonic Wars, there's some other war that you've taken this level of interest in your life. Well, you lived through it, homie. You had 20 years. How many, when you look at the map of Afghanistan, how many of the places can you even pronounce? We can all pronounce Abu Ghraib, right? Sorry, I know it's not Afghanistan. It's part of the same conflict, though. The Abu Ghraib prison, right? We all learned about the names of prisons in Cuba, Camp X-Ray in Cuba, and so on. We learned about these terrible things connected to the American military effort. But sure, there was a sense in which none of us paid enough attention. None of us were involved. And why? This comes back to the title of this video. Because we know we couldn't make a difference. We know we live in a society that is very fundamentally not democratic. That what we know and what we feel in our lives, we have no opportunity whatsoever to make a difference. So I said I was just going to open with two questions, but I might as well kind of close off this topic. I might as well say a few more words about this. Every so often, people. Okay, sorry, Frida. I've got to tell you, you're dead wrong. So Frida says it's mostly bombing, so nothing really heroic. I totally disagree. So I don't know if you guys have. I've watched documentary films, that are really showing combat on the ground, face-to-face, man-to-man combat, and it's tremendously dramatic. I remember seeing documentary footage of a guy. This particular example was on YouTube, and he was coming around the corner at the Taliban, and a sniper hit him and penetrated his water flask. So I think you can imagine a water flask. I think they're 2 layers of aluminum. Could be steel. I think it's aluminum. And the bullet penetrated the metal, but didn't penetrate his flesh. So there's a sniper bullet from the Afghan side in combat. So you saw this, the film footage. This is real life footage. It's not a movie. So you just kind of see the scuffle. And then afterwards, see the guy saying, look, like that's how close that was. He could have died at that moment. No. There are tremendously dramatic face-to-face, knife-to-knife, gun-to-gun combat stories every day of that war. And again, quite a lot of it was uploaded to obscure places on YouTube. Some of it was edited together and put into documentary films. I'm sorry, I could sit here for a minute and remember the names of the films I've seen. The reason I can't remember is that they're spread out over 20 years. So, No, no, no. So, it was a real war. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I mean, I remember one comment. I actually do remember who said this. But I remember one political analyst who was shocked by seeing some of the footage from Afghanistan, and that this political analyst said, "Look, when I'm looking at this footage, it seems like nothing has changed since World War II, because it was men on foot with rifles, like it was that kind of footage." And the guy who was answering was a bit more of a military expert. I wouldn't really, some with some military experience, and he said, "Of course, it's combat. Like, what do you think's changed?" You know, and I kind of relate to both sides of that. You know what I mean? Like, I understand. Like, on the one hand, people think, well, we're living in the 21st century now. We have computers and cell phones, so combat is different. And the other guy who's been there, he has some real world experience. Like, no, it's men in boots with rifles running around in alleyways shooting each other. You know what I mean? And the bullets go in a straight line, and it hasn't changed that much. The guns have become a little bit more accurate. The guns fire a little bit faster. You know what I mean? There are some little changes like that, but no, I mean, there's this sense in which ain't a damn thing changed. So no, another thing that's funny coming out of this particular observation is that, of course, there are a lot of complaints from the left wing that we've all been bathing in propaganda. No, we haven't been. We've all been living in a state of total indifference and ignorance to the war in Afghanistan. Because again, if there were effective propaganda, you would have been hearing every week the names of the heroes and the names of the fallen and the names of the battles and what was happening from town to town and from army base to army base. So the estimate I managed to find was that the United States built 550 bases in Afghanistan. 550 at tremendous cost. And now all 550 of those bases have either been destroyed by the Americans themselves. We don't know, many of them were, or they've been taken over by the Afghanistan. So those were, reinforced concrete, bulletproof, bomb-proof bases meant to last forever. And it didn't last. All right. So I was opening with two questions. First question: what if this turns out to be the most important political event of your lives? And I'm saying this to you honestly. I think it's very likely. I think it's very likely. You can trivialize this, you can joke about it. I think it's very likely that this will be the most important political event of our lives, strategically, economically, and culturally, because this was the question for the 21st century: is what is the future of religion going to be in the 22nd? That's why, again, the title of this video is about democracy, because there was a really hard question for Western democracy to ask itself here. And George W. Bush came up with the wrong answer. I sure wish there had been some other country, whether it was England or Italy or France. I wish there had been some other Western democracy that came up with the right answer, but none of them even tried. George W. Bush didn't have a whole lot of competition. It wasn't as if some much more intelligent approach to war in the Middle East came out of Europe or Canada or South America or anywhere else. But this is possibly the most important question of our times. Now, if I'm wrong, it would only be because an even bigger war now begins with China. I doubt it. It's incredibly unlikely. Sure, if a war breaks out with China that costs $2 trillion, then we'd be able to look back at the war in Afghanistan with its puny $1 trillion $1 trillion total and say, like, well, that really wasn't such a big war. It's true. You could now have a war with China of such immense scale that it becomes clear the most important question of our century is about communism versus democracy, right? But as of this moment, looking back at the last 20 years and looking forward to the next 20 years, it is really fair to say this was the most important political event of your lives. It's one of the most important economic events. Just the amount of money that was spent on this, right? And there's this tremendous cultural question that I'm asking again and again on my channel, and that most of us in Western democracy are very, very comfortable with asking. So the second question I wanted to ask you in terms of giving us a sense of the seriousness and meaning and direction of the channel is, would you sign up to fight for the future of democracy in Afghanistan now, today? Now, it's very difficult to imagine a parallel universe in which we had leaders who actually celebrated heroism instead of cowardice. That's what we've got. What we are living through right now is the apotheosis of cowardice. Now, let's be real. All that anyone is saying, whether it is the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Canada, the leaders of France, England, Germany, all that they're saying is, oh, we should evacuate as many refugees as possible. 20,000 refugees, 80,000 refugees. We should run and run and run. We should retreat and retreat and retreat. The only person I've heard with any backbone was the Vice President of Afghanistan. You probably already know that the President of Afghanistan has run away, apparently with a very large amount of money. I don't know if it's in a physical suitcase or what, but he somehow transferred a huge amount of money with him. But, the president ran away, and the vice president stayed in Afghanistan and said that he is now assuming the role of president, which apparently is the legal procedure. Apparently that is normal. And he said he would rather die with a bullet in his front than a bullet in his back. The war is not over, and that he is going to fight to the death for his freedom. Gee, there sure is a lack of any verbiage of that kind from the United States of America or anyone else. Imagine if they had been saying that, not just for the last 2 months, but for the last 20 years. They were saying to the Afghan people, look, this is your fight. This is your future. This is your freedom. There will be no refugees. There will be no refuge. We are not going to airlift out any of the translators. You are going to stay here and you are going to fight to the death for the future of your country. And that's what you're signing up for. That could have been the message for 20 years leading up to this point. It's not. So I digress to deal with this, that we're living through a period of time where we're just all celebrating cowardice and calling it human rights. Right? It's not what human rights is about. Okay. Okay. If I were to ask you, if there were a call for volunteers, if we didn't have spineless cowards for political leaders. And let me just digress on that point for a moment. If we didn't have in every single one of these countries a system of election whereby you only get one leader, you don't get to elect a separate military leader. It would make sense not just to elect a leader for the military, but multiple. We should have had elections for who was going to lead the war in Afghanistan. If you're talking about the American Army, I don't know if you know this, there's a separate division of the American Army just for Africa. It's called AFRICOM, like Africa Command. But America has a division of the army dealing with Colombia, dealing with East Asia, with Japan based in Okinawa. It's a huge world-spanning army, as you probably know. But you could elect one man to be the head of the military within the United States, domestically, and one for overseas contingency operations like Afghanistan. No. You're allowed to elect one guy. So who do you elect? Barack Obama, man of war. Can you imagine Barack Obama wearing a bandolier and being on the front lines and saying there will be no refugees? It's better to die with a bullet in the front of your chest than a bullet in the back. So guess what, guys? We're in it for life. We're in it together. And this is your country that you have to fight and die for. That would have been a very different message for the 8 years Obama was in power. The 8 years in which Obama raised the cost of the war in Afghanistan from $14 billion a year to over $100 billion a year, and yet made the U.S. military less effective. It's a very real question for democracy. I don't think anyone in the United States of America has access to the information to know why. I do not think there are things. I've done a lot of reading of this over the years. I could mention some little isolated piece of information. I don't think there is enough transparency in real democracy for anyone to give you an analysis of how the budget went from $14 billion a year to over $100 billion. It was like 105. I mean, it wasn't way over. It was just slightly over $100 billion. But it's over $100 billion a year, and yet became less effective. Obviously, there were terrible strategic decisions made, both politically and just strategic in the sense of military strategy, narrowly defined. Barack Obama was obviously the wrong man to elect to win this war. In some other parallel universe, George W. Bush could have been a tremendously competent person to win the war. His father was the head of the CIA, in case you hadn't heard. It's certainly possible that George W. Bush could have grown up with a deep understanding of CIA, black ops, strategic and military considerations. But George W. Bush was the wrong man to lead this war. Probably going to have to come back to that later in this issue. And he was the wrong man ethically He was the wrong man religiously. Like he was the wrong man culturally. There was a level of sophistication. He's the wrong man linguistically. Do any of these guys speak a second language? How many languages does Barack Obama speak? I've never even heard him speak Spanish. George W. Bush could speak a little Spanish. I've heard him speak Spanish. I've never heard Barack Obama speak any other language. But, I just say, you can imagine the type of man who would have been necessary to lead the United States to victory in Afghanistan. And it's not George W. Bush, and it's not Barack Obama, and it's, of course, Donald Trump. Of course, it's not Donald Trump. But also, by the time Donald Trump was in power, he was just looking for the exit door. He wasn't trying to win. He was playing to lose and trying to lose under his preferred conditions. That was all that was going on at that stage. So the question I'm asking here, this is question number 2 of 2, is, would you join the army today and fight for the future of Afghanistan? I'm going to tell you my honest answer, and some of you, I think, will have just never thought of this before, right? The real question is, what Afghanistan are you fighting for the future of? If you tell me that you're going to fight a war to get rid of an Orthodox Muslim tyranny and replace it with a government that is 95% as Orthodox Islamic and deeply corrupt and just barely democratic. But I don't know if you guys have Googled this. I have. I've read all this. I've read all this stuff. I've read a lot of United Nations reports on what was going on in Afghanistan. Look up when the last time they had mayoral elections in Afghanistan was, and when they had elections at all, and how many people actually got to vote in the elections in Afghanistan. Give you nightmares. And they had a kind of fig leaf symbolic commitment to democracy. There was barely any democracy. So to fight against the Taliban, to replace it with an American client state that is 95% as Muslim, and it's only 10% more democratic, that doesn't really interest me so much. For me to fight and kill and possibly die in the name of the government of like Hamid Karzai, are you joking? Like that's what you want me to fight for? That's what you want me to create? To try to create a republic in Afghanistan where, once the war is over, if you actually win, where I would never go on vacation, where I would never take my own kids on vacation. Like it would be no, this is a horrible Muslim fundamentalist place. You would never want to go there. That really doesn't appeal to many people. That doesn't drum up a lot of support. I have this memory. I think it was from 2002. Now, I know September 11th, 2001. I'll tell you, on that political issue, throughout the whole year of 2002, it felt like September 11th had been five minutes ago. It'd been 5 weeks ago. You know what I mean? Like time stood still. And like you could talk to people in 2002, even early 2003, and it seemed like September 11th happened yesterday. I remember I talked to a stripper in 2002. This is in, I won't say where. She was a white Canadian stripper. Okay. And I could Google her. Maybe she's on OnlyFans. Maybe she has a website. I remember this conversation. And when you talk to strippers, I got respect. I got respect for strippers. I got respect for sex workers. I got respect for some people. But when you talk to strippers, one of the things is their job in our culture. They often have to chit chat with clients. And sometimes they kind of switch into saying something that they've said to like 50 clients before, like it gets a good result from that, like within conversation. So it's not special to strippers. Probably if you talk to a therapist, it's like that too. Like every so often your therapist does what? A hairstyle. Yeah, Melissa give the example of hairstyles. Yeah. You talk to a hairstylist and they kind of chit chat with people every day and there's something similar. But I remember I talked to this stripper and the war in Afghanistan came up. And she said in this like smug, self-congratulatory way, she said, by the time this war is over, you won't be able to find a single copy of the Quran on this earth. I mean, you can imagine, I was already it's a long time ago, but it was already this kind of sophisticated, cynical person about politics. And, like I'm kind of trying to ask polite questions, but it's like, you really think this is a war to destroy Islam? Like, you really think that's what America's even trying to do? Like, let alone what's going to happen? Like, what the outcome? Like, you know? And she did. I mean, she thought, obviously, she had no access to information aside from the news, or maybe she listened to talk radio or something. You know, oh, that's interesting. Sorry, it's good. It's a nice distraction. But someone in the audience says Obama claims he used to be fluent in Bahasa Indonesia. I don't believe him unless he can show receipts. I really doubt Obama can speak that language. Easy language to learn. One of the easiest languages in Asia or in the world, if you aren't a native speaker of the family. But still, yeah, I know a fair bit of language. Anyway, yeah, it was funny talking to someone who, from her perspective, really actually thought that this was a war. But I mean, right? No. But here's what I can ask is: do you think of this as a war between Christendom and Islam, or do you think of this as a war between atheism and Islam? Yeah, I mean, okay. Well, Melissa, you're sort of saying secularism. What do we mean by secularism? We mean atheism. I mean, come on. Can we just be honest about it? Like, right now, if we could be honest about it, would you join the army? Would you fight to create a genuinely secular, genuinely atheist democratic republic in Afghanistan? Oh, now I'm interested. Now you're talking to me about something that's worth fighting for and worth dying for. And maybe you could recruit people from all over the world. I'm certainly within Central Asia, even. Maybe you'd then have a cause that would really divide things along very clear lines. Now, a significant percentage of people in Afghanistan would be highly motivated to support the Taliban. If you made that clear, if you said, look, this isn't a Muslim republic, like 95% as Muslim as the Taliban, that happens to be the client of the American government. This is really, truly an American-style, secular, atheist democracy. There would be people who, instead of being wishy-washy about which side they want to support, would then adamantly decide that they want to support the Taliban and fight against that democracy. And you know what I say? Good. All right. Progress requires disambiguation. So we make clear choices. Progress requires clear lines of demarcation. And instead, what we've had is one lie after another. So just very briefly, I don't think anyone is going to find this controversial. The war started with a very different premise. And that premise was revenge. Right? So people were recruited at the start of the war, say 2001 to 2003, and not just Americans, Italians, Belarusians, across Europe, across the NATO alliance and around the world. People were recruited to support the American side for the sake of revenge. And you could definitely make an argument that within a year or two, certainly by 2003, they had accomplished it. Okay, you had your revenge. You bombed and killed a bunch of people, mostly random people, mostly innocent people. It's war, right? And now you can pack up and go home. And I think that's why the budget was so low in the first several years of the George W. Bush period. Revenge is cheap. Now, I think that it's a great mistake to describe what happened next as nation building. This is a ponderously vague phrase. What happened next, it's classically, quintessentially American. Right? The British don't think this way. The Italians don't think this way. The Germans don't think this way. What the Americans did was to conflate conquest with charity. No other country in the world can conflate conquest with charity because they know what it is to be conquered. Germans know what it is to be conquered. Italians know what it is to be conquered. Oh, you say the French won World War II? No, they lost twice. France was conquered twice in World War II. All these other countries have a sense of the real significance of conquest, of the power and the powerlessness and the opportunity to change things forever that ensues for a short time after that conquest, right? Americans invaded Haiti, and they told themselves it was a charity, and they believed it, and they still believe it to this day. Just over 100 years ago, not ancient history, but over 100 years ago, the Americans invaded the Philippines, and they told themselves it was a charity. And they believed it, and they still believe it to this day. When the Americans fought in the Korean War, they told themselves it was a charity. They didn't even want to refer to it as a war. They called it a police action. They invented the term peacekeeping and police action. They were so resolute in creating this illusion that the Korean War was not a war that they had the Japanese police fight in the war alongside them. And that was only a few months after the Japanese had signed their commitment that they would never have an army and would never participate in any war ever again. At the end of World War II, Japan made that commitment because the United States forced them to. They would become a pacifist nation. Oh yeah, but you can still fight in Korea because it's not a war. It's charity. Still to this day, it's possible. If it's possible, this has changed in the last 5 years or something. But to my knowledge, still to this day, if you go to the American Library of Congress, the most important library in Washington, D.C., you will never see the Vietnam War categorized as or referred to as a war. The Vietnam War, we still pretend, was not a war. It was a police action or it was a conflict. Okay. Back on September 12th, 2001, the idea of a war with Afghanistan was incredibly popular in the United States, incredibly popular with the American people, incredibly popular with senators and congressmen. They would have, if you had a referendum, if you had direct democracy, Americans would have gladly voted to start that war. They didn't. They didn't declare war at all. The war in Afghanistan followed the same pattern. The war in Afghanistan was not a war. Americans didn't admit to themselves it was a war. It started off as revenge. And then what it morphed into, the cultural trope that took over, is this incredibly powerful cross-current in the American imagination that it's not a war at all, that it's not conquest, that it's a charity. Now, I'm going to argue against myself. Most YouTubers don't do this. Most YouTubers present an argument like this, and it seems strong, and then you just let it stand there unchallenged. I challenge my own ideas. I argue against myself. And in that sense, you get to see the limits of what it is I'm doing here. You get to see that it's true, but it's only true up to a point. All right. I had a friend, I might as well say who this was, but anyway. I had a friend who was a very old German man. I've mentioned him before. He was a small child during World War II, but most of his memories were of the aftermath of World War II. He did have childhood memories of World War II, but then he was really paying attention immediately after World War II. He was old enough to understand what was going on politically and so on as the rubble was being cleared away, so to speak. And I remember he said to me passionately, and this is a guy who's been to Vietnam many times. He said to me passionately that the Americans could have won the war in Vietnam if only they had been willing to engage in more brutality, if only they'd been willing to really kill people who were their enemies and who had wronged them. You know, that the Americans were too humanitarian in their approach to war. And this was my way of talking at the time. The way I talk to people has changed a bit. And I sat there and said, what about you? is confused. I said, what about your mother and your father and you? You were our enemies. When we conquered you, how were you treated? Everyone knows. Everyone knows the Germans were treated better than the Vietnamese. I mean, when you think about it, this is a crucial part of this American misconception that conquest is charity. Because the minute you conquered the Germans, you started behaving like you're there to save them. You're there to rebuild the German economy. West German, East Germany was conquered by the Soviet Union. You're there to make it into a showcase for how great capitalism and democracy can be. This contrast between East Germany and West Germany. Exactly the same pattern in North Korea versus South Korea. By the way, the minute you conquer, you don't want revenge. You don't want to massacre them. You don't even really want to put anyone in prison. And a puny percentage of the members of the Nazi Party were put on trial at Nuremberg. It was a merely symbolic number of people were put on trial and executed. But I was saying to this guy, seriously, I said, look, what do you think the people of Vietnam ever did to us that we would want to massacre them? Now think about what you did to us. Literally, you and your mother and your father. And you explain to me why we didn't kill you or why we didn't permanently occupy your country, why we didn't loot and pillage. I mean, you could make it into a province, you could make it into a territory of the United States, make it, you could colonize it in that sense. But we could force you all to speak English. It could have been the end of the German language. Could forcibly assimilate you. That's it. We could do all kinds of terrible things to you. We could have changed Germany forever. We paid the price in blood. Nobody has ever done to us anything as terrible as what the Germans did. And nobody has ever done to kind of the fabric of human morality anything as terrible as the Germans did. I admit, Joseph Stalin, it's close contact. Mao Zedong, it's close contact. I admit, once again, nevertheless, there is something uniquely, mind-blowingly atrocious about the atrocities of the Nazis and Adolf Hitler. So, you want to talk to me about revenge. You want to talk to me about brutality. I'm sorry, what did we do to you? And now you tell me how you want us to treat others. How do you expect us to treat the Vietnamese or the people of Afghanistan or the people of Iraq? All of those wars were ongoing at that time. Now, I think this is worth talking about primarily because nobody in America thinks it through. Nobody mentates it. And if you want the weirdest one of all, look at the reconciliation process that happened in Italy. All right? Italy continued to be completely full of fascists. It was completely dominated by fascists, and nobody cared. Like, nobody in America was interested in enforcing some kind of systemic reform on Italy. It was just like, well, war's over. And by the way, the number of years that went by between when combat ceased and the working out of the final peace treaty. So you had an armistice, and then later you had the treaty. All these years went by, and there were these weird negotiations. And, guess what? The Italians didn't change. And Italian government, why? Okay, we killed all these people, and our own people died, and there's a cost of untold billions of dollars. Okay, why don't we have a beach in Italy? Why isn't part of Italy a colony of Canada forever? Why? Absurd. Let's go back to 18th century, 19th century rules. Oh, I'm sorry. Why shouldn't the borders of the Netherlands be expanded permanently to take a piece of Germany? That's the way we used to settle wars. Would be to divide up Germany, and France gets part, and the Netherlands gets part, and the United States gets part, and Canada gets part. All the contributing armies, but including adjacent armies, would divide up the land of the conquered enemy nation that started the war. That's how we used to do things. Yeah, we used to also reduce people to slavery. I mean, that was how we used to get even at the end of a war. Slavery, serfdom, or you'd become a second-class citizen in your own country and be forced to speak someone else's language. You could have a part of Germany where everyone's forced to speak Dutch, another part where everyone's forced to speak French, and so on. That's how wars used to end. America changed that forever in this totally bizarre, unexamined way. Now, in the 20th century, I just point out, nobody else was playing by America's rules. Nobody else had this misconception of humanitarian warfare, conquest as charity. Nobody else did. So, if you look at the way Russia fought wars, and obviously you have the Tsarist period, and then you have the communist period. But in the communist period, the way foreign policy works, it's exactly the same, where wars are fought fundamentally to move the border. Like it's basically what it is. Russia has a war with Poland. Russia has a war with Finland. There are all these crummy Soviet wars. Russia has wars. What you can look. Have any of you ever looked at a map of where Russia's border with Japan is? The closest country to Japan, the closest foreign country is Russia, because Russia kept all of the land they marched over. They own several islands of Japan, including the enormous Sakhalin Island, which has priceless oil and gas reserves. Priceless. Billions and billions and billions of trillions of dollars worth of gasoline, even if there's nothing else good about Sakhalin Island and its neighboring islands. Oh, gee, why at the end of World War II, the Russians kept part of Japan? In both World War I and World War II, Russia's borders expanded permanently. And they were the bad guys, remember? Well, why didn't America's borders expand? Why didn't Canada's? Why didn't England? What about France? I mean, France kind of lost twice. Man, you can make it argument. Well, how about, the Netherlands or anyone else who fought against the Nazis? They weren't rewarded. You see, on a really deep level, the unspoken, unwritten rules of war changed, and they didn't make sense anymore. After America conquered Afghanistan, what was supposed to happen next on a deep, unexamined level in the mind of an idiot like George W. Bush? It was the same answer as for South Korea. It was the same answer as for South Vietnam. It was the same answer as for the Philippines, as for Haiti, as for Germany, as for Italy, as for Japan. The idea was, just like Japan at the end of World War II, again, the part conquered by Russia permanently became part of Russia. It still is today. It wasn't just during the Soviet period, not just during the communist, but still today, it's part of Russia. And they kicked out all the Japanese people. It's inhabited by white, blonde Russian people. I'm not joking. It's really, nobody calls it genocide. It's on small scale, but dude, Sakhalin Island is enormous compared to the rest of Japan. I'm just saying, it's not a small island. It's like 50% of the landmass of Japan or something. It's slightly exaggeration. Still, it's huge. Just look it up on the map. Size of Sakhalin Island versus the size of Hokkaido. It's huge. and there were no Japanese people there anymore. All right. They extirpated the Japanese population and replaced them with Russians. That's what happened. America didn't do that to Japan. Right? America played this very strange game that they also played in Italy, in Germany, and so on, which is that they presided over the writing of a new constitution, and then they pretended that they could step back and say, okay, you guys take it from here. And that America would then play this charitable role of building universities and building hospitals and helping industry get back on its feet and exporting tobacco and all this other crap. So I'm just, so if someone watches this video 200 years from now in the future, they'd be like, why is this guy saying this? All this stuff is obvious. It's not obvious to us, okay? Right now in 2021, this is not obvious to anyone. And it wasn't obvious to George W. Bush, and it wasn't obvious to Barack Obama. There was that old anti-war song from the 1970s, the Vietnam War era, 1, 2, 3, 4, what the hell are we fighting for? Nobody knows. Nobody knows anymore. And I asked these two questions at the start. What if this is the most important political event in your lifetime? 2, would you sign up? Would you fight? Would you be willing to fight? And the question is, for what? What the hell are we fighting for? You got to have an answer for that. You have to have an answer at the beginning of the war. Of course, in the middle of the end of the war, but you have to have a clear answer for that. And for the United States of America, it never was to create freedom of speech in Afghanistan, such as you have in Las Vegas. George W. Bush would never be able to do this. You could have had someone who stepped forward and said, look, we are going to fight this war. And when we're done, guess what? We support atheism. We support a secular government. We support Afghanistan having a society where pornography and rock and roll music and gambling and prostitution and neon signs are all legal. We are going to make the city of Kabul into the Taliban's worst nightmare. Not something just 5% different, not moderate Islam, supported by George W. There's nothing moderate about Islam in Afghanistan. No, that will actually create an outpost for democracy, for secularism, for atheism, for human rights. Think about what that word really means. It's ridiculous. We're going to create something worth fighting for. And then you get to ask, who's with us? And you get to find out who's against us, right? You can say, hey, we're going to create universities that aren't universities of moderate Islam, but universities that are really, in this sense, shockingly, challengingly democratic. And then start to think about what that entails. And you know what? Hey, again, I'm just saying, it's so easy to demonize colonialism. It's so easy, right? What I have to say to you is what the United States has done in the last 20 years is worse than colonialism. Any of us, I'm sorry, I know you people haven't done the reading I've done. I'm not saying this to insult you, but I don't know if when you think about colonialism, you're thinking what I'm thinking. Okay? All right. What the United States did in Afghanistan in the last 20 years is worse than colonialism. And I can prove it very simply to you. How many of you know a white person who learned and became fluent in any of the languages of Afghanistan? Can you go to a university in Texas or in Ottawa, you can include Canada, or in Vancouver, that is teaching any of the languages of Afghanistan? All right. As bad as colonialism might be, it involves people going to that country and learning the language and getting married and having kids who are half Afghan and half American, or whatever the combination may be, half black, half Afghan. Let's have black people going over there and really living with them and really learning their language and really changing their culture. And where they also have some kind of positive relationship with us, maybe we start having more Afghan restaurants. I don't know. There's something positive they can bring. I like Afghan flatbread. I'm vegan, but the flatbread I just mentioned, if you can get it vegan, you know what I'm saying? I completely understand why colonialism has the bad reputation it does. I am living in a country built on genocide. Don't get me wrong. But in the same way that I am morally opposed to aristocracy, but I end up having to kind of defend aristocracy to explain to people what it really was and how it worked, because aristocrats were not just parasites. They weren't vampires. They weren't evil. They played this incredibly important, positive role in our society. And we destroyed them. And we destroyed everything they'd accomplished and the whole society they created. And there's really a tragedy there. And if you have real human sympathy and empathy, and you really do research and engage in analysis, you can understand. You can understand that really the world was coming to an end for them, as we, the next generation, arguing for democracy and meritocracy and Republican ideals, we destroyed their world, to create our own. I completely understand the way in which, colonialism now seems laughably outmoded. It's laughable in the same way aristocracy is, right? We can't think of colonialism as anything but a hated relic from the past. But it's still worth questioning. What if we have a system or a lack of a system? What if we've done something that's actually worse than colonialism? What if, when we compare it to what actually would be accomplished in 20 years of overt colonialism, what if that would be something better than what it is we've got now? Okay, guys, I'm got a nice quote from that song too. All right, guys, I'm gonna take a minute to read what's in the comment section. Melissa, you want to chime in? I was just going to say, I know I said at the beginning of this, I'm making this partly because I got a bunch of emotionally overwrought emails from people, and I'm emotionally overwrought about it too. I made a live stream back on August 13th about it. It means a lot to me emotionally. It's not just politics. It's not just theory, or what have you. We had 31 people in the audience. Guys, if you want to take a moment to hit the thumbs up button, if you change your mind later, you can hit a thumbs down. I'm just now going to take a minute to pay more attention to usual comments. Melissa, you want to say? Yeah.
I'm really glad that you're making this. But I know you have not mentioned terrorism. That this is known as the war on terror.
Yeah, right.
Do we feel that we've destroy terror, the possibility? Do we feel safer as Americans? We are safe.
Right. So this is actually a good example. Melissa raising something. I didn't say it because I don't think in those terms. So Melissa raised an interesting point. She said that I haven't used the word terrorism once. This is 50 minutes into the stream. And she said it was indeed originally kind of propagandized as and promoted to the public as, pardon me, the war on terrorism. And then she's asking to what extent are we actually safer from terrorism? And of course we're not. Of course, instead, it's justified terrorism and expanded terrorism and increased funding for terrorism. And within that part of the world, it created the whole phenomenon of ISIS. So ISIS was the most amazing blossoming of both Muslim fundamentalism and terrorism imaginable. And that was, it was unanticipated and unprecedented. Out of the ashes of the American conquest of Iraq, the ISIS phenomenon emerged. And it was, for a short time, it was tremendously successful, and then even more money had to be spent on American aggression against it. So look, okay, why do I not talk about terrorism? Okay, I think that the terrorism optic or categorization, it exactly serves this same end of eliding. I'm going to use some great Scrabble words here. Eliding, obviating, and obfuscating. 3 great words. Eliding, obviating, and obfuscating the question of whether or not we are fighting a war for atheism, right? So, if you really believe this is a war against terrorism, and I think George W. Bush personally did believe that. George W. Bush was a profoundly Christian person. I'm not saying that because I have any respect for it, but he was a devout Christian extremist, frankly. All right. And what he said again, and he really believed, was he was only fighting a war against terrorism. He wasn't fighting a war against Islam. He wasn't fighting a war for atheism. He wasn't fighting a war for a secular society. He didn't even want that within the United States of America. So just to give one illustration, we could talk for an hour about the religious conscience of George W. Bush. But, he removed the division between church and state that formerly, so I have to finish that sentence. It's more to the sentence. But prior to George W. Bush, if you had a soup kitchen, so a soup kitchen is an American invention where you are giving soup and food to poor people, homeless people. That's called a soup kitchen. But if you had a church-run charity giving away food to homeless people, and you also preached the Bible or preached salvation or something, you had to physically separate them, and you also had to legally separate them. You couldn't have them together. And you actually saw that in action in the United States of America, where the separation of church and state at that level of how charities were run. Sorry, it's not even church and state, but the separation of religion from these other functions. That was necessitated down the line. So he actually removed that, where for the first time you could integrate those into one service. Now, in other countries around the world, in Canada, there isn't that requirement of separation. It's a significant thing. And when I was living in Cambodia and Laos and so on, it was a big deal. He removed the separation of church and state. And another significant thing, which is that he made it illegal for the government of the United States to support any kind of charity work, development work, any kind of program anywhere in the world related to abortion. As I recall, I'm sorry, I forget the precise word. I think it was also anti-condom. I think it was about, like, they wouldn't do anything related to pregnancy. Like, it was defined in some way like that. So it was meant to be abortion, but it really got rid of things related to birth control pills and things like that too. And some Christian fundamentalists in America, they think birth control pills are also a form of abortion, and they're morally opposed to them for that reason. So I'm just giving these as examples, the extent to which George W. Bush personally, he was devoutly Christian, and he was trying to Christianize the United States and American politics. Whether or not he succeeded, it's up to you. And I remember when he left office and Obama came back into power, everyone in like Cambodia and Laos and that kind of charity work was like, oh, finally, now we can go back to doing abortion and condom related stuff, and birth control pill stuff. Like there was this really weird period where all that was religiously charged. So, the idea that it is possible to fight a war on terrorism as opposed to a war against Islam or a war for atheism, right? This is a delusion, right? Now, this is a profoundly related question. Okay. Did the United States fight a war against fascism in World War II? Well, at the end of World War II, what did they actually do to get rid of the fascists in Italy? All those guys were still alive. I'm sorry. So what percentage of Italian fascists were put in prison or given a trial? Absolutely minuscule. Nothing changed. And within Germany, too, bureaucrats and mayors, they had worked in the Nazi regime and in Italy, too. If you were actually fighting a war against fascism, right, the final outcomes of that war and what you would really do, I'm not necessarily saying you'd have to kill all those people, but you would have to do something to actually eliminate fascism. And the Americans didn't. The Americans, again, it's this really strange delusion of what is victory, what is conquest, and then what is charity. The idea was that they just show up, they sign a piece of paper with the Italians declaring the start of a new era in history. And then they presume that because of the guiding light of America's morally superior example, the Italians will just sort themselves out and fascism will disappear. Now, the only thing I'd say is Japan was a success story. Maybe Japan is the only example in the world where this American method worked. Take a look at Haiti. Take a look at the Philippines. I mean, take a look at American interventions everywhere. But even I know it's not a military intervention. Well, okay, then I won't. Let's not. Okay, I won't include non-military interventions. But take a look at Cambodia. Take a look at former Yugoslavia. I mean, any of these things, the American idea of what winning the war means and what the outcomes of war mean. So, I do think the idea of a war on terrorism is really a dangerous idea. There are intelligent people everywhere. There are free thinkers everywhere. There are homosexuals everywhere. Homosexuals matter a lot more than what you'll hear right now on the nightly news. So all this bullshit about, but what about the women in Afghanistan who want to become want to have a career and want to go to university and stuff? What do you think happens to the homosexuals in Afghanistan? I haven't heard that mentioned once. Not once in any of the news coverage. Not once. Homosexuals and lesbians, whatever. I'm treating it as the broadest possible category. How about transgender people? It's so fashionable to say we care about transgender and cross-dressing people. What if you're transgender or cross-dressing in Afghanistan in 2021? Huh? How's that going to work under Taliban dominion? For some reason, nobody's interested in asking these questions. If you think nobody in Afghanistan in the last 20 years has been questioning why should you have an Islamic society at all, you're wrong. Now, I'd also mention that in the last 20 years, the population of Afghanistan almost doubled. So the percentage of people in Afghanistan alive today who were alive 30 years ago is incredibly small. It's a young population who mostly grew up in the conditions of this war, in the conditions of this American mission. And I'm sorry, I may have mentioned it too briefly, but it's because I feel everyone already knows it. You also know that America really discredited itself morally, ethically, and so on in terms of use of torture, in terms of the actual ways and means employed in the war. But yeah, look, there is no such thing as a war on terrorism. There's a war against Islam, and there's a war positively to create democracy, to create secular atheist societies, to create more highly educated societies, to create more modern societies, to create societies that are integrated into neighboring states and cultures and the modern world. And, I'll just say, I have a lot to say. Okay, I'll read the comments on it. All right. Good. So, guys, I'm just reading this in order, but I'm catching up pretty quickly. There's a sincere comment here from Henry Gann. So Henry says, quote, "The hubris of America is that the world wants to be just like us." I don't think that is the hubris of the United States of America. Okay? And let's get real. Okay. Everyone wants to vote. Everyone wants to be able to complain that the government is corrupt and to have their complaint matter and have their complaint make a difference. And I'm going to take a further step here. If you're familiar with Plato and Socrates, this will make more sense to you. Okay. Everyone wants that, even if they don't think they do. You can reveal it through pretty quick, Socratic method. So Egypt is profoundly culturally alien from England, France, Canada. Profoundly. I think people underestimate just how culturally different the Egyptians are from us. Okay? Egyptians want to vote. Egyptians want to be able to control their government and hold it accountable. If they want to be able to complain and have their complaints matter, whether that's about corruption or otherwise, they do not want to be powerless before a small class of multimillionaires. There are rich people. There are poor people in Egypt. There are also some incredibly rich people. They want to have a government that is by the poor, for the poor, of the poor, and that represents the interests of the masses, represents the interests of people as a whole, against the moneyed elite and against the elite within government itself. Elite people who are part of it. They do want that. Okay? And you can talk to some Egyptians who don't think they do. You can talk to Egyptians who will tell you that as a matter of religious conviction, they feel that they shouldn't have any role in government at all. They should just leave it all up to God. It's a very common belief in that part of the Muslim world I just mentioned, in Egypt specifically, and its neighbors. You can imagine what a convenient religious belief that is to have, one of total passivity towards politics, because you say it's up to God to decide those things. But if you sit down and talk to those people about, Socratic method, about real life situations, and they will have been through some of them. Okay, what if your son disappears and then you find out that he's been beaten and interrogated, and after being beaten and tortured, he's confessed to a crime, and the crime happened in a different town, and you can prove from the records on his phone, like text messages he sent, and maybe he uploaded some photos to Instagram, that he wasn't in that town, he was in another town, but he's been beaten and he's already confessed. And if you say this to people, it probably hasn't happened to their own son. They know people, their cousin, they know somebody, or whether it's in the newspaper or their friend's friend, they'll know horrifying, terrible stories like this about how awful the quality of government and policing is in Egypt and how deep corruption runs. This kind of thing. You can come with all kinds of examples. There are two businesses, and one of them's connected through corruption to a military official, and one of them isn't. And then, bad things happen to people. So, if you sit down and talk to someone, even someone who tells you as a matter of religious conviction that they don't want democracy, if you can explain to them what democracy is in that way, when they understand it, they will understand that they do want democracy, because the alternative is to live in fear. I was saying, Laos. Laos is a communist country. Everyone lives in fear. China, communist China, in many ways a wonderful place to live. But let me tell you something, people live in fear. And I've said this before on the channel, so I'm saying it very briefly. When you really get to know China, foreigners won't understand this at first. Like if you're an American, you just arrived. What you realize is the higher up the socioeconomic pyramid people are, the more afraid they are, the more they live in fear. People in China who are university professors live in fear of the government all the time. It's really scary, So, I understand what you're saying here. You said, quote, the hubris of America is thinking that, the rest of the world wants to be like us. Okay, democracy is not a haircut. Not everyone wants to have an American haircut. Democracy is not a tattoo. Not everyone wants to have American tattoos. Okay, everyone wants to have democracy. Everyone, even if they don't think they do. All right, and a huge part of politics is making decisions on other people's behalf for their good, for their benefit. Like, if you don't believe that some people get to make decisions for others because it's in everyone's best interest or it's because it's in their best interest, then you don't believe in politics. Politics is centrally and integrally and inextricably about coercion. So I had a little slip up there. Didn't integrally. Politics is about coercion. Now, in the absence of democracy, politics is only about coercion. When you have democracy, it's also about participation and consultation. It's about a lot of other things, not just coercion. All right. Okay. So look, someone called Paco Miera Ex Vida says, so I'm going to read your whole comment, Paco, if I may call you Paco. Quote, talk about Reagan funding reactionary terrorists like Hekmatyar or abandoning Massoud after Omar Mohammed gained ascendancy over Afghanistan, the CIA betrayal of Abdul Haq, or how U.S. foreign policy did. Okay, Paco. Okay. Now, I'm asking you two very simple questions, right? And one of them is, are you willing to sign up and fight for democracy yourself? Like, in the context of these discussions, I hate to tell you, but like, there is a sense in which the moral record of the United States or England, do you think I like the British Empire? I'm living in a country built on British Empire genocide, but it is almost irrelevant to this question now. Looking forward, the sense in which it's relevant is it gives us a sense of their biases, their limited competence and capabilities and attitudes going on. The past does matter in that way. But however much you may want to fault or impugn the character of the United States of America, the United States did commit atrocities during World War II. The United States did commit atrocities in what we could now call the Korean War, the war between North Korea and South Korea. Okay. Would you prefer to live in North Korea or South Korea? Would you be willing to fight for the future of democracy in South Korea? I would. I'd fight for South Korea. Why? Just because it's a secular democracy. No other reason. I don't have to like Korean food or something. I don't have to change my haircut. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be any other reason than that. The difference between South Korea and North Korea is worth fighting for. Something I've been saying again and again in this video in slightly different words is the tragedy of the war George W. Bush designed and created was that the difference between the American-supported side in Afghanistan and the Taliban wasn't worth fighting for. It was too slight a difference. There was the Taliban, there was another government that was 95% the same as the Taliban, right? So you could say North Afghanistan versus South Afghanistan to simplify or something, right? The difference between urban Afghanistan and rural Afghanistan wasn't worth fighting for. The difference between North and South Korea is worth fighting for. I have read detailed accounts of massacres of innocent civilians by the Americans in Korea, North and South Korea. Right? I have. You may or may not have. You can take the time to do it. I'm aware of that. But these are the decisions we have to make, right? Now, I do think there's a much more important, nuanced, difficult decision to make about democracy itself, democracy in America, democracy in Canada, which is what I'm getting at with the title of this video. But in a really simple sense, I think people like you, Paco, have to face up to the fact that no matter how many massacres the Americans carried out in Korea, North Korea is still wrong and South Korea is still right. Because that is how important democracy really is. All right. I remember reading a dedicated article talking about the position India was in shortly after World War II. It was difficult. It got more difficult. And I now know more about this today than I did at the time. But it was saying, India was in this position where they were being asked to become an ally of the United States of America. And at that time, America was so racist that like political leaders from India couldn't even go and visit America and walk around like a normal person. They were treated as black, and they were treated with even more hostility because they didn't understand the social cues. Like, they didn't understand, oh no, this is a whites only restaurant. They didn't understand, oh no, you can't walk in here at all, or oh no, you have to take off your hat and meekly ask them to make lunch in the kitchen in a brown paper bag for you to take out, but you can't actually walk into the restaurant. There were all these weird barriers and social cues for just how intensely racist the United States of America was. And there were these very difficult debates in India where these are people within the government elite and within the military elite, were basically saying, look, like in a lot of ways, the United States of America is evil. It's evil, and it's built on slavery, and it's still unbelievably racist today, and they're racist against us, and we're not natural allies. But this democracy thing is so important that we must be in an alliance with America against Russia, against China, etc. It was a very difficult argument to make, and it was a very, very shaky relationship between the United States and India. And in 1971, it broke down, and America and India became enemies in 1971. But there's this period between India's independence and 1971 where there's this very difficult match. So, I mean, again, my point is there, and you can just imagine viscerally, personally, what it would be like to be a brown-skinned person from India, or possibly a dark black-skinned person from India. I mean, they have variation in their complexion, and to go and visit America in the year 1955 or something, and to be treated that way, and where you can stand on the bus, and whether or not you can take a taxi, and where you can sit, and where you can eat, and whether or not you can swim in the hotel swimming pool, all the miserable racist forms of oppression. And oh no, you need to see a dentist while you're here, or a medical doctor. Oh no, you can't go to that dentist. You have to go to the black people's. Like, the reality of what it was like being in the United States of America, if you were from India, you were an ally, it was unbelievably evil and unbelievably demoralizing. And then, of course, beyond that, even when there wasn't formal racism, there was all the informal racism. And people in India had to really say, wow, this is our ally. This is democracy. So, I mean, what America represents today, it's something much more positive than in 1955, And, this does not mean that I have infinite patience for massacres committed by the United States of America in the name of democracy, nor torture. But my complaint there is simply fundamentally that we don't have enough democracy, that what we need is more democracy, not less, in order to have armies and foreign policy that makes sense democratically, that's transparent and accountable and adaptable democratically. Okay. Sorry, so I'm reading ahead in the comments now, guys. All right, looks like there are a lot of quality comments here. Okay, so again, I'll read this from Paco again. So Paco says, quote, Afghanistan is where U.S. foreign policy revealed itself as self-serving, close quote. Paco, are you 12 years old? What do you mean U.S. foreign policy revealed itself as self-serving? U.S. foreign policy is self-serving. Who else do you think they're serving? You think they're serving Saudi Arabia? Like, who do you think they're working for? The American government works for itself. And once in a while, it works for the American people. I'm sorry, but I mean, this just makes me think you're 12 years old. What do you think? Yeah, this is not a secret. American foreign policy is supposed to serve America's self-interest. This ain't something new that just came out of nowhere. Okay, so William, again, I sympathize with the comment, but I totally disagree with that. So you'll see. It's a well-intentioned comment from William. William says the Taliban wasn't smart enough to give up their radicalism and accept the charity that would have been given to them. He then says, we helped rebuild Japan after the atom bomb and the firebombing of Tokyo, etc. So William, the sense in which I sympathize with you is you've correctly understood part of what I was saying earlier in saying America was trying to repeat the same pattern that you saw in the conquest of Japan and the writing of a new constitution for Japan and so on. And then Japan really in a profound, meaningful sense, ceasing to be a fascist country. The total moral regeneration of Japan, you could say, within 20 years. It is, I think, unique in the history of the world. I think it didn't happen in Italy. I think it didn't happen in Greece. I mean, you can look at a lot of countries after World War II, and you can say they changed a lot less after World War II than they should have. And you can talk about what happened in West Germany, too. To what extent did you have a veneer of democracy painted over fascism and just real live fascists continuing to live there? Now, I think 50 years later, Germany has changed a lot. By the way, that's kind of another story. But I say immediately, you're talking about the 10 or 20 years after. Okay, so William, I think that the mistake you're making here is just you're accepting the propaganda narrative that this was something other than a war on Islam. It was a war on Islam. It still is a war on Islam. And it's a war for atheism. And the problem is that none of the Western democracies that exist today actually identify as atheist. None of them can say that. And none of them have their own constitutions written that way, right? The relationship between church and state in America, in England, in France, in Germany, none of these countries can claim to represent atheism or even secularism. And that wasn't effectively what they were fighting for. But when you accept that as the primary basic premise of what was going on in this war, then of course, what do you mean? The Taliban can't compromise. For them, this isn't just life and death. This is about their immortal soul. They are fighting and they are dying and imagining they're going to heaven forever, and they will do anything for the future of that illusion. So there is no negotiating with the Taliban. This is the hard limit of democracy. These are the people who can never participate in elections and can never negotiate and can never compromise. That's why we're at war with the Taliban. And the same is going to be true with Hamas. So I was laughing the other day because a vegan YouTuber, made this ridiculous video where she was claiming that buying a certain brand of hummus was preventing negotiations that would bring peace to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. I was laughing aloud and saying, "Oh yeah, right. Negotiations with who? Negotiations with Hamas? There would have been these great negotiations with Hamas." It's just ridiculous. So by the way, guys, we got 38 people in the audience now. We only have 17 thumbs up. I mean, you guys have been enjoying this for over an hour. So if you hit the thumbs up button, it'll help the channel and help more people discover the video. I mean, if you hate the video, you've been listening for more than an hour, so thank you. But it would kind of make sense to hit the thumbs up button. As I said before, if I say something that really shocks you, you can send me an email. You can talk to me. You can talk to me now in the comment section. But if it's something more serious you want to disagree with me about, you can send me an email. You can contact me through Patreon, and you can change your mind later and undo hitting the thumbs up button. But yeah, I think at this point it's reasonable for me to ask. Okay, so right, Frida's making an interesting point. I say this kind of thing to Melissa all the time. So Frida, many people on the left try to misrepresent the current era of American imperialism as if it were traditional colonialism. And it's not. It can never, the analysis never makes sense. It doesn't operate at a profit at all. They don't even recoup their losses in the slightest. So I'm going to read Frida's comment in a second, but you guys may not know this. The British Empire in India operated at a profit. They insisted that the people of India pay enough taxes to finance their own conquest and occupation. How perverse is that? So the people of India had to pay taxes to pay the British Army to conquer and occupy them. Now that's colonialism. right? Now, there's another sense in which you can have colonialism. I'm going to read the thing from Frida, where like one country conquers another and then just takes all the diamonds, takes all the gold. You know, it's extractive colonialism where it's operating at a profit that way. But nothing like that happens in the current epoch of American imperialism. It's all done on this charitable basis. It's money losing to an unbelievable extent. And Frida said, quote, and I don't think the U.S. has really exploited Afghan resources, have they? Opium. Afghanistan's most valuable export is opium. Continuing, quote, colonialism in Latin America also included education and religious indoctrination aside from the exploitation of minds. Yeah, that's great. So yeah, I mean, I'm making exactly that kind of contrast. That, I'm willing to say colonialism was bad, but actually what we've done in Afghanistan in the last 20 years is worse. And you can take a look back at the videos I made about China and Xinjiang, and where I'm able to say very comfortably in those videos, well, if you think what China is doing in Xinjiang is bad, what America has been doing in Afghanistan is much worse. It really is. Worse in principle, worse in practice, and worse in its outcomes. Because guess what? What China did in Xinjiang actually works. And that's because the Chinese are willing to admit to themselves what it is they're trying to accomplish. They're trying to create a secular future for Xinjiang, not what the Americans created in the government of Hamid Karzai and so on. Yeah. Well, so Brett Anderson says this, and I'm saying this. I'm trying to get you to sympathize with all sides of this equation. Brett Anderson says, quote, let's pronounce your name properly. Brett Anderson says, quote, I always saw this as colonialism. So many white folks always seem to see themselves as the good guys when they go on to other countries with guns. It's weird. We shoot you because we want you to be free. Close quote. Okay, Brett. But what about when white people go to other countries and learn the language and get married and raise kids and work on a farm and with time produce a new hybrid culture? Right? That's the contrast with colonialism, right? Is where you actually have a meaningful engagement with it. The Americans in this whole thing, they just behaved like mercenaries. They were all there temporarily. It was temporary for 20 years. And again, the extent to which Sanskrit was taught in universities in England, the extent to which England became a place where people learned the languages of India so that they could go and rule India. And it wasn't for charitable reasons. People studied Sanskrit and Arabic and other Indian and Middle Eastern languages precisely because they wanted to get a job in the colonial administration. But colonialism may be bad, but what we have been doing is worse, and it is definitely worse in its outcomes. Now, I just want to say very briefly, because you said white folks, not just white people engage in colonialism. There is a parallel history that's easy to imagine that the United States of America could have conquered Afghanistan as they did and set up 550 army bases as they did, and they could have invited in hundreds of thousands of people from northern India to colonize Afghanistan. You said, okay, we're going to protect you, and people from India could come and intermarry with and live permanently with and participate in gradually transforming the culture of Afghanistan and integrating it into the modern world and integrating it into a more cosmopolitan world. The United States could have involved many other countries and nationalities in terms of colonialism in the old-fashioned sense of it. Sure, there's no reason to presume it would be white people. And in the history of the world, generally, all kinds of non-white people also conquer and colonize other people. So there isn't a single dimension in that equation. Yeah, someone else got the hummus reference. So there you go. Provocative quote from Nacho. Nacho says, quote, do we go to the left where there's nothing right or go to the right where there's nothing left? I have never heard that before. Yeah, for all I know, that's on a Hallmark card. If that's a political slogan, that is one I've never heard before. Henry Gann says, You could do a 24-hour stream and still not cover all the mistakes made in this war, laughing at the stupidity, crying at the tragedy. Yeah. Okay, guys, I'm happy to wrap it up there. I'm going to return to my original question. What if this was the single most important political event of your lifetime? You know, looking back now, what difference could you have made? What difference should you have made? I think all of us feel that the tragedy of our own ignorance, our own indifference towards this war, our own relative detachment from these political events as they unfolded happened precisely because of our own certainty that our involvement, even just our knowledge, our lobbying could never make any difference. Now, I'm willing to imagine in a science fiction universe, you could have a society with too much democracy. I can imagine that. There is nothing like that on this earth today. I cannot think of any society that exists in the 21st century where you can say there is too much democracy. Babe, could you grab me Xenophon? It's at the right-hand side of the right-hand shelf. Thanks, babe. I just want to say, okay, ancient Athens was not paradise. Insert a whole bunch of cynical comments about, slavery in Athens, blah, blah, blah. The level of democracy within the military in this period of ancient Greece, the role of elections, the role of the lower ranks being able to question the higher ranks because they elected them, because they vote for them, they follow their orders, but they also vote for them. The role of democracy within an army, and in this case, it's an army in a foreign war, it's an army overseas, so to speak, it's an army far off in Persia. The level of democracy that was taken for granted in a hierarchical military unit where if you misbehaved, you could be whipped, you could be beaten with rods, you could be killed ultimately. Like if you did something bad, if you fell asleep when you were on watch duty or something, you could be beaten, you could be whipped, you could be outright killed by your commander. But you elected him. You elected the person in charge of your battalion, of your unit. In this war, everything worth knowing was secret. And the greater tragedy is, even if you could have known more, because probably all of us feel we could have. Oh, I could have done more research. I could have done more reading. That if you had known more, you couldn't have done more. And it's not just a lack of democracy in the United States of America. I'm sorry, again, it's 20 years ago. It's so easy to forget. What about extraordinary rendition? What about torture? What about the rules of engagement? What about shooting innocent civilians and children? There were all these things that meant so much to me. They meant a lot to me, 2001, 2002, 2003, like right at the beginning of the conflict. I cared passionately. What about the ethical questions about the use of drones and drone strikes? What about the ethical questions about the use of depleted uranium bullets and depleted uranium armor? There are a million really serious ethical questions. But sure, one of the simplest, torture, interrogation. What about the ecological questions? What about even strategic questions that none of us were a part of? I remember at one point, this is part of why Barack Obama's military budget was so great. Barack Obama was using a type of missile. I'm not going to quote the brand name because I might get it wrong, but I remember reading this detailed article. He was using a type of medium-range missile, and depending on the conditions of it being fired, it could cost $1 million per launch. So the most expensive way to launch it was from a submarine. But they very frequently did launch them from submarines. I could get into the details why. It was like if you launched it from land, it was only $500,000. If you launched it from a submarine, it was $1 million. But it's just like the per missile price. But the attitude of Barack Obama, and everyone today is quoting this number, 2,500 Americans died, 2,500 Americans died. Well, you had leaders who didn't know war and didn't care about war. Guys like Barack Obama, guys like George W. Bush. You had guys who didn't know Islam and didn't care about cultural change, didn't care about really having a plan for the next 100 years. How are you going to change the fate of Central Asia forever? How are you going to change the fate of the world forever by saying, this is democracy, this is Islamic fascism, you have to make a choice. Now, who's with me? Let's fight for it. Because you're going to spend $1 trillion either way. So you're going to waste $1 trillion, you're going to spend $1 trillion and make a permanent difference on planet Earth forever. But you get a guy like Barack Obama, whose whole mentality was to have as few people as possible on the ground, as few boots on the ground as possible, as few American lives lost, and then willing to spend $1 million on a single missile strike. This extensive use. He massively expanded the role of drone strikes and everything else. And you know what that makes you? It makes you a coward. And even if you win those battles, if you win them with anonymous, faceless drone strikes and missiles that drop out of the sky, you know what you lose? You lose the respect of the people. And it's goddamn hard to win the respect of the people. And you got to learn their language. You got to live with them. You got to eat their food. And you got to marry their daughters. And you have to send your women to get married to their sons. Conceptually, in America, that's somehow harder. Somehow, like white man, foreign woman is easier to deal with than white woman marrying an Afghan man. And you've got to commit all the way, not to supporting a homophobic Muslim fundamentalist government that's 5% more democratic than the Taliban. You have to commit to saying, oh, no, you're going to have gay rights here, whether you like it or not. And you get to say, as Barack Obama, it would be easier for Barack Obama to say than for an idiot like George W. Bush. You get to stand there and say, hey, guess what? 10% of you are gay, whether you know it or not, whether you admit it or not. I know there are no gay rights protests in Afghanistan. There weren't any in 2001. There weren't any in 2005. There weren't any in 2010, 2015. I know there aren't going to be gay rights protests. You aren't going to rise up and demand gay rights. But I know there are 10% of you who will benefit from this. And I am going to fight for your rights, even if you won't. And I'm going to present you with a future of Afghanistan where gay people get to openly be gay. And they can even watch, a soap opera about gay people on TV or something. This level of modern liberal cultural, assumptions. Where you really represent that and really pursue that, and then you back that up with boots on the ground. Imagine if anyone back in 2001, let's say December of 2001. If someone had sat there and said, look, with 20 years and $1 trillion, how much do you think we can accomplish for the future of Afghanistan? How much do you think we can accomplish for the future of Central Asia? How much do you think we can accomplish for the future of atheism, for the future of secularism, changing the Muslim world forever? Taking what was the most extreme Islamic dictatorship in the world, what was more extreme than Saudi Arabia, right? Of course, more extreme than Egypt or other examples, and turning that around so that it becomes an outpost for democracy and atheism and open homosexuality and feminism and women's equality in education, so on and so forth. George W. Bush's failure ultimately was a failure of vision, and it's too late. I'm so sick of hearing this phrase, learning the lessons of history, learning the lessons of the Vietnam War. Sorry. Okay, guys. So now it's 2021, right? It's too late, right? It's too late for us to make that difference. It's too late for us to have that vision for the last 20 years, but it's not too late for us to have that vision for the next 20 years. It's not too late for us to start thinking seriously about the next century. Now, I try not to quote my own book too much. I'm writing a book and it's not finished. But, there's various parts of the book that are really passionate and hopeful, in contrast to some of the incredibly bleak and hopeless material about American politics. But, one of the things I say at one point in the book, I just say to the reader directly, look at China now and think about how different it is from China 100 years ago. We can be that different again in the next 100 years. We can change our own society. We can change our own culture. We can change our own politics. We can make much more progress in the next 100 years than the communist dictatorship of China made in the last 100 years. And I know I'm all alone on this, guys. I know that nobody else sees it that way. The furthest left-wing person is profoundly conservative compared to me, because when they look at American culture, they think nothing can change. The most left-wing person in France lives with this same kind of hopelessness and this same kind of resignationism, because they think nothing can change. Now, when you look at Afghanistan, again, 20 years ago, nobody looked at it and said how much change is possible with $1 trillion in 20 years. A lot of change is possible. A tremendous, profound, fundamental, cultural, social, political change is possible that would have made the world a better place. And one of the reasons why we didn't accomplish that was that was not even what George W. Bush was trying to accomplish. That wasn't what Barack Obama was trying to accomplish. There was something better possible. And, we bungled it. And you and I and everyone in this audience, we all have blood on our hands. All of us are responsible. There was no amendment to the Constitution about torture. It never happened. Oh, we cared so much about it. 2001, 2005, and then we just forgot. There was no amendment to the Constitution about extraordinary rendition. There were all these profound, fundamental moral problems, none of which resulted in new legislation. We didn't change. We didn't adapt. We didn't learn the lessons of history as it was happening, and we haven't learned the lessons of history, now that it's over. I want to make a different point about Afghanistan. When you look at where Afghanistan is today and when you look at where we are now, I want to say to you that we can make even more progress than that in the next 100 years. In the next 100 years ahead, we can be more different from the people we are now than we are different from Afghanistan. All right? The darkness of the dark ages can finally come to an end in Paris and London and New York. We can have a future that is really genuinely secular, that is really authentically atheist, that is really profoundly, directly democratic. We can have all those things, but it's going to start with admitting to ourselves that we ain't got it, that we want it, and that we'll have to make terrible sacrifices to make any change at all.